AAA defines a security architecture that is comprised of three functions referred to as authentication, authorization, and accounting. We know in our networks, we have so many users, so many hosts. So this host, we must give them different authorization, different rights that they can access the different resources. And also, we must authenticate these users. We cannot allow everyone access to our network, then they can access to our resources. It's not secure. So we must have a way to authenticate them. And when they are online, we must have a way to account them. So we have two ways of two protocols. One is Radius, the other is Huawei Takax. These two protocols can help us to authenticate and authorized and accounting the users. Okay, upon completion of this section, you will be able to describe the schemes of the AAA security architecture and successfully configure the authentication and authorization schemes. First, let's look at the AAA application. So, in this network, we have a domain, and in this domain, we have several hosts. And then we have some destination network and the AAA server. So the AAA enables the authentication, authorization, and accounting of users attempting to access the destination network resources. So in this destination network, we have some resources, we have some servers. So we can allow some of the users are able to access the resources. Some of the users are not able to access the resources. So how to achieve this? We can deploy an AAA server so the server can authenticate the users and authorize the users. First, let's look at the authentication. For the authentication, first we must have a router A. This router A could be the network access server. So on the router A, we can configure some username and password for this user. So for example, here is host A. If host A wants to go to this network, he must go through this NAS. So he needs to send his username and password to router A. And when router A receives the username and password, he will check the database. And if this password can match the database, the router A, it will send successful to the host A. So the host A will be able to access the destination network. So this is authentication. Authentication can help us to protect our network. If someone else, for example, host B, access to this network, but host B doesn't have a password and username, so he cannot access to our network resources. So in this way, we can protect our network resources. Next is authorization. For authorization, we can configure some groups. For example, we have device group, private group, and public group. And we can configure different servers into different group. So server A belong to private group and server B belong to public group. Okay, and for the user, we can also configure the users to different user group. For example, they can be admin group or staff group. And we can configure the time range. In different time, we can allow different user to access different device group. For example, the user belong to staff group. Between 9 o'clock and 18 o'clock, he will be able to access the public group resources. And his privilege level is 2. And the other group, admin group, in this time, he will be able to access the private group servers. So the authorization function can help us authorize the users. Authentication help us authenticate the users so that the users can access to this network. Then we can give these users different privilege levels. So different users, they have the rights to access to the different servers. So this is authorization, okay? Next is accounting. Accounting means, okay, when one host access to this network, and we want to account these users by the time or by the bandwidth or by the traffic. So when this user access to the network, we will start to account this user. For example, the login time, the username and uptime, and the bandwidth, the up bandwidth and the down bandwidth. So from these parameters, we can account these users. We can use the time to account the users. Also, we can use the bandwidth to account the users. Okay, that is accounting. Next, it will be AA domains. To easily help us manage the users and manage the servers, the destination network, we can configure the domains. Okay, the domains means we can configure different users in different domains. Different users in different domains. And different domains, they will have the different privilege levels. They will have the different authorizations to access to the different destination network. Okay, so it will be easy for us to manage all of the network resources and to manage all of the hosts. Okay, so let's continue to look at the configuration. First is AAA local configuration. AAA local configuration is configured on the router A. Local configuration means we need to configure it locally on the router A. So on the router A, first we enter AAA. Then we create a username, Huawei, and password, hello123. And then we configure authentication scheme. The name is Authentication 1. And then we set the authentication mode to local. This mode, we can have different modes. First mode is local. It means we will authenticate the users locally. On the router A, we store the username and password. If we configure the authentication mode to reduce, it means we will use the remote reduce server to store the username and password to authenticate the users. Okay, and then we create an authorization scheme. Name is this one. And also the authorization scheme, the authorization mode is also local. Then we create a domain. Domain name is Huawei. And in this domain, we bind these two schemes to Huawei. Authentication scheme and authorization scheme. Okay, so this is AA local configuration. Then we can use display domain name Huawei to check this configuration. So we can see in this domain Huawei, we have configured the authentication scheme name is this, and authorization scheme name is this, because we didn't configure the accounting scheme. So by default, the accounting scheme will be default. By the way, the AR router does not support the accounting, so we don't need to configure the accounting scheme locally on the AR router. If we want to use the accounting function, we must use the remote server, for example, a reduced server, to achieve the accounting function. Okay, let's look at two questions. First, which two AA schemes are supported when configuring VRP to support the local mode? Okay. First, local mode. We know we have different mode. First is local mode. And we also have the remote mode, the Reduce and Huawei TACAX. For the local mode, we only support authentication and authorization. It doesn't support the accounting. Does not support the accounting. If we want to use the accounting function, we must deploy the remote server. For example, we must deploy the Reduce server or the Huawei TACAX server. Okay, second question. If no domain is defined for users, what action is taken? Okay, if no domain is defined for users, the users by default, they will belong to the default domain. And the device, it has a default domain name will be default. Okay, the default domain name is default. So if we do not define this user any domains, it will belong to the default domain.